Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Songwriters on Process podcast. My name is Ben Okapari, and since 2010, I have interviewed hundreds upon hundreds of songwriters about the writing process. I have a PhD in English language and literature, and I'm a writer myself. So I've always been interested in treating songwriters the same way that we treat poets and traditional prose writers, as writers, plain and simple. There is no talk of how bands get their name, favorite tour stories, favorite foods, band drama, or anything else. This is an intelligent conversation about the writing process between two writers as we go deep, deep, deep into the writing process. That's it, nothing else. And with that, let's get into today's episode. And today on the podcast, it's Christian Lee Hutson. But first, if you are a frequent listener to the podcast, you may hopefully recognized my new intro music, and you'll hear my new outro music from my good friends in the band Tennis. Elena and Pat are dear friends of mine, and they have graciously allowed me to use the music from their song Need Your Love, but that is also a shameless plug because they have a new album coming out, Tennis does, called Face Down in the Garden. It comes out in April. The new single is called Weight of Desire. But that's my new music. Very excited about it. I love it. So anyway, enough of that. Let's talk about Christian Lee Hutson. He is a frequent collaborator with Phoebe Bridgers, but we're not going to talk about that today. That's the only time you'll hear it. We're going to talk about just him as a songwriter. His new album, Paradise Pop 10, is out now. I love this conversation because we went deep into, not just how we write, but I think why we write, and really got deep into the psyche of the writer. I mentioned this many of times, but I bow, and I say this in this episode. I bow to the altar I kneel at the altar, I should say, of Anne Lamott, who wrote a great essay called "Shitty First Drafts," which to me, as a prose writer, is very important. That the first draft of anything is supposed to be atrocious. You've got to let yourself write badly. And we talk about that a lot on this podcast. And Hutson told me that his biggest hurdle is trying to hack his brain to become less critical. And I mentioned to him the songwriter Matt Nathanson, who I've interviewed a couple times. And he has what he calls the assassin. He's in constant battle with the assassin on his shoulder. The assassin is that thing that's telling him to edit as he writes. And he's constantly in the battle with that. And I also mentioned in this interview, and I'd forgotten about this, Martin Sexton I had on the podcast a couple of years ago. And he says he does this thing where when he'll sit at a desk and I'll have two speakers in front of him. Each speaker is playing something totally different. Could be country and metal, could be talk radio and pop, two completely different genres playing at the same time. And that chaos really gets his brain going. So that was a big focus of this conversation. Again, the importance of making mistakes and not being critical as you write. And we draw parallels in this conversation with improv comedy and surprising yourself as a writer. And that's I think the benefit of not being too tied up in knowing what things are supposed to look like before you start and being okay with making mistakes. I think any type of artist should follow that. So that's what we talked about. Christian Lee Hutson and I talked about on this episode. We talked about poetry. He's one of the few songwriters I have interviewed who loves poetry. So we talked a lot about that as well. Anyway, Christian Lee Hutson's new album is called Paradise Pop 10. And here's my interview with Christian Lee Hutson. Enjoy. Outside of songwriting, do you do other types of writing, whether it's journal writing, any type of prose writing? Are you strictly a songwriter, or are other types of writing that you like to do?
I've written a bunch of short stories, and have like sort of I don't know if I'll ever actually publish it, but a book of short stories, and then I'm like dipping my toes in the novel writing process. I have like sort of beginning and a vague concept of something that I would want to do. And so I've been slowly working on that. And, but it's stuff I don't know if I'll ever do anything with, just like fun. I wanted to be a writer when I was a kid, like not a songwriter. I wanted to be a novelist.
So I should know this, but are the short stories, where are they published?
No, there's like one or two of them have been published in like really tiny, like literary, like weird literary zine kind of that kind of thing, but nothing major. Just if people knew that I wrote or something and approached me, and I was like, "Yeah, you can have this story, sure."
So do you find any overlap between those two? I mean, the processes are very different. I mean, I think songwriters or prose writers will tell you write every day, butt in the seat, doesn't matter how bad it is. Songwriters, for the most part, tell me they don't operate that way. It's, they don't write everyday songs if they're not feeling it. But I guess does being a short story writer, did that make you more disciplined as a songwriter? I guess I'm curious if those processes overlapped at all.
You know, not I've been writing songs for so long, and I've done so many different types of like I've I read a book about Randy Newman, and he goes to an office every day and writes from literally 9 to 5 and then goes home. Um and I was like, I've tried that. I've also tried like don't write. Whatever you do, don't write and wait for something to come, and then eventually something does come. I've tried um you know different like journal and the more the artist's way type stuff. I've done a bunch of different I've experimented with different approaches to that, and I'm not, I don't know if I know what the best one is. Now I kind of like, when I feel like it, I will do it. And sometimes I will set aside a month where the only objective of that month is to hopefully write some songs.
But when you're writing prose, that would be hard to do, wouldn't it? I feel like prose writers would never say, I'll write when I feel like it. It's more number of pages or words. Like when you wrote those things, was that different?
It was a little bit, well, it was a little bit different. I guess I was writing every day, and when I do work on that kind of thing, I tend to write a little bit every day. I am a one thing I do regularly that I find like helps all kinds of writing is journaling every day for therapeutic reasons. And usually it's like just I feel like it familiarizes, or like it lessens your critical brain, and it familiarizes you with the act of putting pen to paper and like actually uh seeing what your thoughts look like out loud, so that when the worst is you haven't written anything in 6 months, and the first thing that comes out, you're like, I hate this so much, I'm gonna stop immediately. um yeah.
So do those song ideas ever, or do the prose ideas or the journal ideas, do they ever make your way into song ideas, or are those things separate?
No, I think they just make the muscle of like trying to externalize your emotions and thoughts a little bit stronger. um like talking doesn't really necessarily do that, but like talk therapy, I feel like it's like a yeah, written talk therapy or something like that, which it just makes it makes me less critical of whatever goes down on the page and more trusting of myself to edit. I feel like there's always like the tendency for, or I don't know, this might be a projection or whatever, but a lot of other songwriters I know are very like, if they're not in the practice of like trusting themselves to edit, they will be the first three words that come out of their mouth, of the day. They're like, I'm such an idiot. I can't do it. I can't write anything anymore. um, and people that are more familiar, I feel like, with like trusting themselves to edit are like those three words, and then these three words, and then another page, and then like, and we'll sift through it, as opposed to like trying to self censor or something.
My favorite essay when I was a professor, I would always assign the essay "Shitty First Drafts" by Anne Lamott. She's still alive, Anne Lamott, and she wrote a book called Bird by Bird, and "Shitty First Drafts" is in that book. And I bow to the altar of that essay because her whole premise is the first thing has to be shitty. If it's almost like if it's really good, that's probably going to be a problem because you're editing too much. But don't be afraid. And
Um,
that Faulkner has some quote. Actually, I think I have it up here. Faulkner said, "I've got this quote." Faulkner said, "Get it down, take chances. It may be bad, but it's the only way you can do anything good." So the first draft of anything I write is so bad. And I'm a prose writer, not a songwriter, so very different. But spelling is off, punctuation. Part of it is a fear that if I don't get it out immediately, it's going to be gone forever. So I'm like fear. It's almost like I've got to get this out. Um, but what I'll do is the first draft of anything is atrocious. And then I
yeah,
set it aside, and then I come back and I was literally doing something before this interview, and that's what I was doing. It was kind of gradually polishing that thing that at first draft I would be embarrassed to show anyone.
totally. Yeah. I love, I mean, that's same with songs for me. And I mean, I mean, I'm not really much of a prose writer, so I'm like, I haven't figured out that aspect of it. It's like it's right now just my fun place. And the very little bit of editing that's happening is like, oh shit, my friends are going to publish this. Okay. Like, what's embarrassing? And going back through, but like with songs, I love the editing part of the process is my favorite. The sharpening of the thing is my favorite thing. Because then you have like a raw you have something that like looks like a face, and you're like, well, how would I make it look more like a face? It's like, oh, now it kind of looks like Willem Dafoe's face. Okay, like there's I was talking to my girlfriend, and I love to talk about process and because we're both writers, and she's an incredible writer who I work with a lot. And we were talking about the act of writing that's recently the act of writing that is discovery through mistakes or whatever, and watching, and we were kind of having like a sort of like high, like a little bit high conversation that got like kind of spiritual, and like imagining like what I just said, like where you draw like a little squiggle or whatever, and they're like, oh, it's like looks like a nose, and then you do that or whatever. And we were having a spiritual conversation. We're like imagining that like everyone's concept of, or like a traditional concept of God as an all-knowing person, or that yada yada yada. But what if there was a creator that was really just following the tip of the pen and being like, oh, it looks kind of like a mountain, and then oh, there's a forest fire. Wow, that's anyway, I went in a million different directions there, but
No, but I see that. But you're talking about quite literally drawing, right? You're not. That wasn't a metaphor for writing, was it?
well, writing is like that for me too. That was a metaphor for writing. I thought, because I write that way a lot too.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, but which is different, I feel like, than maybe prose writing is not. It's very rarely like I don't know how many people have heard describe it as like throwing out, like listening to your subconscious or something. I don't know, but
I just wrote this because I was getting I'm writing a blog post for my alma mater about the for the English department there about the book that we wrote, and I just wrote this line about an hour ago. I said I don't think I have any right knowing what something is supposed to look like before I start,
mm,
and the biggest mistake I can make, and I'm not speaking for everyone, that I can make is to say, here's the way it's going to be. Um, and I'm going to get there only going this direction. Because I think if you do that, you have no surprises and you don't take chances as a
yep,
prose writer. So I have no right. Like I feel like in a spiritual sense, I have no right knowing what it's supposed to look like. And that's the way I feel. And I think that, but that's kind of for a lot of prose writers, I think that's almost taboo because it's no, you've got to have the structure before you start. But I think most novelists would tell you that they just go where the characters take them.
Yeah, I mean, actually, as you were saying that, I realized I was like, I feel like I've listened to a lot of interviews of like, I love George Saunders, where like George Saunders seems to maybe work in that way, where he's like, oh, that kind of sounds like this person. Now, what if we, okay, what would that person do in this thing? Or like, where he's just fully letting the thing lead him, which as a songwriter, one of the things that I'm always there, it does seem like people, by and large, as songwriters, go in concept and try to make their concept, try to prove their concept with the words. And it makes absolutely no sense to me. I'm actually kind of envious of it, though, when people are able to pull it off. But it seems to me, based on how I work, like kind of like trying to reverse engineer creativity or something like that, and be like, yeah, I don't know. It's much more fun, like you said, to be surprised and be like playing the guitar and you just like accidentally said like the wrong word or you slurred something and it made a different meaning to like I don't know. Mistakes are where things get interesting and then it starts to tell you, it starts to become kind of a unique picture instead of just we're all, I think, all the creatives I know are like deeply bored by their own brains. We love the outside, the weird, like invisible, like string pulling us along. It's like, whoa, that was weird. That's why a lot of people get high or whatever to do this kind of thing. But yeah,
I love to these conversations because new ideas come to me like as we're talking, and one thing that I was thinking about was it's like improv with comedy. Some of the greatest comedy troops or groups, like I was just so funny you say this because I was just watching earlier today old clips of this movie called Stir Crazy. It's with Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor, and when they were in prison together, and apparently almost everything in that movie between the two of them was improv. Like they just rolled with the other one. No one told them, here are your lines. And they're one of the greatest comedy duos ever. And I feel like with comedy, the writing kind of being surprised is just like improv when you're writing. It's no different. It's like improv on the page, I guess.
yeah. Well, and then it feels alive and like whether or not, and I think the most important thing of it, I guess I feel like my biggest hurdle as an artist is constantly being getting over like hacking my brain to become less self-critical. And when you work like that or in an improvised way or where you glorify mistakes and let them lead you somewhere else, you can have the experience of it having nothing to do with your ego, or it can feel like somebody else did it, which is, I think, the things that I've been most proud of in my life are things where I'm like, well, I didn't even do that. I just accidentally, what was ever was like happened or whatever. I just like connected little dots between like random firing synapses and was able to mold it into like know where to start it and cut it off or whatever, which feels much more satisfying than spending a lot of time trying to relay a specific message that I had pre work and molding or something.
I have a couple comments on that just from what songwriters have told me. And I've interviewed Matt Nathanson a couple times, and I had Matt together with Julian Baker, the three of us, and he calls it the assassin. The assassin is that thing on his shoulder that tells him, don't write this. And he says
Yeah.
he's constantly in the battle with the assassin. But naming it makes a big difference. It's like
Totally.
once that thing exists, then it's like I can go head to head with it and overcome that fear of maybe you don't want to write that. Um, and so there's that. And then I had Mary Timony on within the past year,
Wow.
and she said, I love this. She said that she writes in the morning, and then she won't look at that thing until later that same day, like 12 hours later, because she's had enough experience in those 12 hours that she's now a different person. And so she's like a different person looking at that. She's different. She's a different person than she was 12 hours ago. But I guess what I'm getting at is we kind of, if we can make these things concrete, like almost put ourselves, add names to them or something, it makes the process easier.
It really does. I mean, there's there that the assassin thing really reminds me of, there was a big shift in my mind, and like the writing became a little bit easier when I started doing this. The journaling thing that I do is very um I write in, I mean, you're an English professor, so I might say the wrong uh tense or whatever, or whatever it's called, but I think I write in second person where everything is you. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, cool. So I write about myself and what I'm feeling, as if I am another person observing my feelings. And that is really, that I think does that kind of thing, or I like can separate and be and observe the assassin, or without being like the person I my other character that I inhabit when I'm writing about my own feelings is like a fatherly or like a friend kind of figure who's like, you're feeling a little sad today about like this, like you're noticing your thoughts are going to this thing and that thing, and maybe they're going there because of this. Like, I noticed the other day that you did, whatever. Um, I think separating it does seem like really useful and helpful to separate the critical side of your brain, or the feeling side of your brain, and the observing side of your brain, or something like that, and be able to, I don't know, there are so many people that exist within us, and some of us, if we have a lot of friends, will find ourselves at like a party where we're like, whoa, I'm totally different people with this group of people that don't know each other, and now I have to negotiate between all the different personalities, or whatever. We all have that, so I think it's fun to acknowledge it in your, as you work, and it helps. The assassin thing is a really cool idea. Yeah, it's similar, but not quite the same thing as
Uh,
my little trick.
Yeah, I think if we give it a name, then it makes it easier to overcome it, maybe. Um,
Yeah.
this was like one of the first interviews I did was with Jack Tempchin, and Jack Tempchin wrote "Peaceful Easy Feeling," and he did a lot of
Huh.
co-writes with the Eagles. And he said that when he and Glenn Fry would get together and write for Eagles songs, the words that came out were gibberish. They were not fully formed. They were just gibberish sounds, but he called it El Blurto. They named that voice El Blurto, but again, it was that kind of like El Blurto. Oh, there's El Blurto again. But it just made it easier for them to write if they almost had that companion with them.
Alberto is good. I have there's I have a similar version of that I call the mumble game. The mumble game is a game I like to play when I'm working with, when I'm doing like co-writing things, where like we have no idea where to start, or no frame of reference for, especially with a new person, or we're just stuck, where one person just kind of like, even if they pick something long in their notes, or even like a weird like recipe or something off the internet, and the other person tries to passively peripherally listen and see if they can make out what the person is trying to say. You almost like, and then you're I feel like your brain is putting together this weird exquisite corpse. It's like a weird telephone thing, and then you're like, oh, oftentimes you'll just get like one line that's like, that's beautiful and came from no one and was not in the original thing. And, um, but it came from this guy, this old legendary country songwriter, Harlan Howard, who wrote like a million hits back in the day. And he worked like some factory job and would drive in his old truck to work every day and put the radio on and turn it down as low as humanly possible and try to write down what they were saying, what he thought they were saying. And it would often be like a completely different thing that was more influenced by his own life and whatever he was going through without him having tried to make it that way.
I love that because that reminded me, oh gosh, I forgot the name of the songwriter I interviewed, but of course I'm going to remember a second we get off this call. But what he said he would do, someone else told him this. He'll have two speakers in front of him, and each speaker is playing a different song.
Whoa.
So and that and so the chaos of that introduces new songs and new ideas. Um,
Wow. That's an awesome idea.
Isn't that awesome? After we're done, I will tell you who that was because you should go back and read the interview because it's really interesting and he got it from someone else. Um, and it was it's that chaos of the songs and the sounds and not focusing on either one but listening to them together and maybe together it'll be like wow, that's kind of cool, but the words, all that stuff. I thought that was so interesting.
That's beautiful. I mean, that's kind of what creativity almost is sometimes. You're just reorganizing stuff that exists. Like, I don't know. That's why I love like the folk school of things, even though it's like a little bit can get corny, but of like the recycling of the acknowledgement of recycling melody and tradition or whatever and combining it with a new thing. Uh, I love that. Reminds me of that process of putting two different songs on the speaker and being like, oh, okay, well, we're just gonna, here's all of the ingredients we have. We've all got roughly the same ingredients in reality. Let's take that and that and that. And then, like, be like, whoa, this fucking monster has crazy talons and like wings that are bay leaves or, whatever. But anyway,
So I want to get one more question about the journals, and that is when you're writing a journal, do you ever get to a point where you think this needs to be in a song?
occasionally, I would say though that it more like is like a lubricant for the creativity or something. It just primes my brain to receive information as not uh myself or something, or not like one person, but to be it primes me for non-judgmental. I very rarely find something am that I want to put into a song. It's more just like now I've stretched.
I love it. So it's like a warm up, like if it's like if you're playing sports, it's like you're like stretching, like you just said. Yeah,
Totally. And then you're like, oh, okay, wow, I can throw the ball so far now. I couldn't have, I would have been all wonky if I just like started throwing it before that. It's
this
yeah, I mean,
interview is it's this interview is just one long extended metaphor. We've done sports, we've
I've
done.
mixed, yeah, I've done I've committed some cardinal sins, and I've mixed now like 70 different metaphors to describe the
But
same.
I love that though. I love the idea of I'm not doing this. I'm going to separate this, but I'm going to do this because it's going to make me. It's going to prime me. Um, I'm trying to think if I do anything like that. I think I tend to read, and I will talk about reading later. But I tend to read before I write. I find that that motivates me to get
Yeah.
a good voice in my head. Then it's like okay, I'm ready to write. But yeah. Do you when you revise, like I as a prose writer, there are certain things that when I go back and revise, like I look for specifically. Like I try to get rid of as many prepositions as I can. That's very,
Mm.
like the ofs and the ats and the ins, and because it just make things verbose. I know that's different from songwriting, but when you go to revise songs, are there certain specific things that you look for?
I look for if I've used a word that I'm like that is a really expensive word, and I try to simplify. The biggest thing when I'm going back through and when I'm really writing with anyone is trying to get as close to like how like me and my friends would talk, as close to like a very like direct, simple human uh communication of something. And because I'm easily confused. I easily get taken out of it with other people. Like I feel like some of the best, my favorite combination of things is uh like 20% poetry, 80% uh like conversational or something. um so I often will look for that kind of balance and be like, is there enough like magical beauty of the mystical, unexplainable thing in conjunction with I'm just a guy walking down the street. Hey man, can I bum a cigarette? Like, not those aren't lyrics, but like you know, like real things that feel like real life, and not like I'm trying to put on a to seem a certain way.
When Mark and I were writing the book, it occurred to me that the drafts he would send me of the prose, it was very direct. It was not ornate language. It was, direct and simple. And then it dawned on me that that's because, as a lyricist, also, that's what you have to do as a lyricist. So I'd
Yeah,
love to do more of a deep dive into like the collective body of memoirs by rock musicians, or when they write prose, if it naturally is more direct in their prose. Because, and it dawned on me, I was like, wow, Mark's writing is so, it's um I remember our editor said that it was like Bukowski-esque in some of the, not in the content, but in kind of like the directness of the prose. And it occurred to me that that's probably because, as a songwriter, you have to do that.
you might. I mean, I've never thought about it before, but there does seem to be like a value in being as direct as possible, just because you don't have very much time. Like you're like the train is coming, and like everyone's about to get off the subway, and your friend's about to get on the subway, so you have to be like, wait, meet me on 9th Street, or like, um, not talking. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of like that about it. I mean, I like that you're limited in what you can communicate, and because of that, there's so much space to. I always talk about like the ghost collaborator, like everything that you work on, at least as a songwriter. But I think this goes for most different art forms or whatever, is a co-writer, like a co-composition with the person who will eventually listen to it. So you have to leave enough space for them to fill in their own life into the cracks of it or something, if that makes sense.
It does. And you reminded me of something when you talk about, getting all those words into your friend before the train leaves. Um, I write really well under deadlines.
Yeah.
And so I will intentionally create a false deadline for myself. So a false deadline isn't, oh, start the stopwatch. How much can I get done in an hour if I don't have to do anything after that hour? A false
Right.
deadline is, my wife and I are going out at 6. I'll start writing at 5, because I know that I have to stop in an hour. Um,
Yes.
and I learned that about myself because I travel a lot for work, and we live in DC, and I go to New York a lot for work, and I'll get more done in that 2.5 hours on the train than if I sat here for 2.5 hours, because I have to put my laptop away. So it's that same concept of, it's amazing how much you get done if someone says to you, no, in an hour, like, you have to be done. There's no other option.
Totally. Oh, I mean, I actually, I don't often do that, but the last record that I made, we kind of, it was my first time where we booked studio time with maybe only one finished song. And we are like, all right, in a month, I gotta have like a whole record, I guess. Um, and that was really helpful. I mean, that and working with my girlfriend Maya was just like, oh, like now we have like it comes so much, it comes so much easier that way for me as well, or at least it did that time. And I'm now I'm flirting with making another record and trying to do the same kind of thing.
The songwriters who surprisingly tell me how productive they are, more productive they are when they're parents, when they have kids,
Yeah.
because the kid's down for a nap, you got an hour.
Yeah.
You love to watch television, but you got to get that thing done because it's your only block that you have to yourself. And it's like, holy shit, I can get so much done in that hour.
Yeah, I feel like I've talked to other people about this too, like and that always has been my biggest fear about. I'm like, oh, whoa, do I like if I have a kid, like, do I just like, can I not do it anymore? Where do I find that time? Because so much of my time now is like, wow, like, oh, we're out here in the world, like, oh, that's kind of a pretty thing. Oh, cool, there's that there, and then an hour presents itself, you know. But yeah.
So logistically, I want to ask you the very specifics of the process for you. Are you a pen and paper person or a computer person when it comes to lyrics?
I'm a phone person. So I use my notes app in my phone. And I also I weirdly yeah, I'm that way. I also write a lot while I'm driving when I can't use my phone, and I try to hold the like a verse in my head, and then I'll like be editing that one verse in my head like for a 2-hour drive. Then when I stop, write down like okay, that's pretty solid. So I've already like thrown out different most of the whiteboard is in my head until it's like pretty close.
There's a book called The Friendship by a guy named Adam Sisman. It's about the friendship between Wordsworth and Coleridge, the two romantic poets.
Yeah.
And they said, and Wordsworth walked like they estimate like 100,000 miles in his life because what else are you going to do, at that time anyway? Just going to walk all day.
Yeah.
But he would compose his poems on walks and he would revise them in his head and he wouldn't come back until they were fully formed. But that was part of it, which that's mind blowing that you could do that, given how some of his poems are. But he would say, "Nope, it's going to revive. I'm going to revise it." Um, so here's my question for you, because I actually have this quote up here by David Byrne, and David Byrne said, "A car is a good place to write lyrics. Driving occupies one part of the brain, one part of the brain, freeing up the other."
Hmm.
So there's a couple things I want to ask you about. One is, and I think that goes to the bigger issue, is we get our best ideas when our brains are engaged in an unconscious activity. Agatha Christie said that the best time to write a book is when you're doing the dishes. So our ideas come to us when our brains are engaged in unconscious repetitive motions. I mean, quite literally things like vacuuming, gardening, doing the dishes, cleaning, things that require no conscious thought allows the unconscious to bubble up. Um, but I imagine though, if you're driving, you need to be driving in a place that you've been a million times before. Because if you're trying to like find those directions,
Right.
I mean, practically that's got to be difficult. So have you ever thought about that? And I guess the bigger issue, the bigger question is, do ideas come to you other times when you're engaged in activities that require no thought?
Totally. I mean, driving has been a big one just because I spent most of my adult life on tour, and a lot of that time on tour by myself, doing like 8 hours on a one highway or whatever. So that's a repetitive task just because you get on I-40 or whatever, and then you're like, okay, the next time I have to get off is in 162 miles. And I mean, but like, yeah, city driving where you're like trying to like, wait, is that the turn? That is not necessary. That is a horrible place actually for ideas. But yeah, other times definitely like cleaning, doing dishes. I used to like, I have an early memory of before I was on a record label, like burning CDs and coming up with little packaging and doing my own little assembly line. Where for hours I would do that. And during that time, I wrote a bunch of songs for my first record, actually doing that kind of repetitive task. I think are that require no conscious thought. I think are fantastic for. It's like the judge. I always think it's the judgmental side of your brain is turned off because you're like that part is occupied with something. You're like, okay, go play with these blocks over here, assassin. Um, and then you're like, the real us needs to get some work done, and then that thing turns on.
It's fascinating. I love reading about those things, about the when the ideas. I mean, they call it the eureka moment. It's why there was an article in the Washington Post about a year ago, and it was about why we get our best ideas in the shower. And it's that idea is that when you're, in the shower, where it's that you're just kind of by yourself, and it's relatively, things you do by memory. That's when it's why we get those eureka moments. And then I say that to people. It's like, oh yeah, I keep my phone next to me on the sink
Yeah,
because I get those ideas all the time.
totally. Yeah, I think those I the most I think because I'm most familiar with songs having come while driving. I'm like, oh, that's the place that it happens most of the time. But I know that I'm cleaning the house or something. Usually after that, I'm like, sit down and write a song.
Okay, last question. Because we've talked about authors already, and I did read that you are a fan of Raymond Carver. And Carver tends to come up. I mean, we've talked about directness of language, but I mean, very broadly, there are certain writers that get mentioned most by songwriters. Carver is one of them. Bukowski, not as much anymore. Kurt Vonnegut, Cormac McCarthy, and right. I mean, it's all those people. What do they have in common? Like brutal concision. Um, but I'd love to know, like, I'm not before you answer. I mean, my reading habits are, I'm not an author person. When I finish a book, there are a few people that I will read like whenever they've written anything, but when I finish a book by someone, my first instinct is I want to get another voice in my head, not
Right.
that same voice. So I'd love to know what your reading habits are in general and who you like.
I do kind of the same thing. I mean, I very rarely am like a completionist or like I've read like bits and pieces. Occasionally there's like an author that I'm like, I love this voice. I need more of it. But more often than not, I'll read a book and then I'll start looking for a different voice to lead me through the next things. I'll be like, all right, that feels done. Um, I love this. I talked about him a lot for my last record because so much of it I wrote while reading his books. But there's a guy, an author called Scott McClanahan from West Virginia who I love, and he is somebody that everything he's ever written, I've found like weird, like small press published versions of stories of his. Like I just kind of eat up everything that he writes. And he's also very direct. Um, it's like you're talking to your friend Scott, who's like, it's a lot about his life. And he's like, and your friend Scott's kind of like, tells you about like some crazy stuff that happened in his life. And then at the end, he just kind of like goes a little psychedelic, but deep stoned thought about it. And he's like the king of ending like a heart wrenching chapter. He's the king of last sentences. That he like it just culminates in this weird, like childlike kind of like. And then I thought about the beauty of the world, and I thought about how we're all just. I mean, I'm doing a bad impersonation of him. It's much more beautiful than this, but I love him. It's very like uh Appalachian hardship, and then with like a genius fortune cookie, like the best fortune cookie you ever got at the end of every paragraph. Yeah. And then I don't know. I there are books that have really affected me, but uh I've like Alexander Chee wrote a great book called Edinburgh that I love that changed my life. I The most recent thing that has stuck with me that I read was a memoir by this guy Blake Butler about his wife called Molly. I'm kind of like often looking for things that are kind of, or recently I've been looking for things that are kind of new. I just read Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton though, and that was incredible. And
Wow, you're going
a
old
weird
school.
well, my Maya's like is deep into has been kind of like giving me like an education in like what I would have called like flowery, like how do I latch onto any of this? Like I can't, and she is very good at contextualizing things and like modernizing something in my head, and the way that she contextualized this Edith Wharton novel got me really excited about it. And very like I was able to make connections that when I was in school and we have to read like Jane Eyre or something like that. I'm like, really? But yeah, I don't know. I'm branching out a little bit. So yeah, I don't know. But she's often good at taking something that she really loves that is not in my chosen um, style of prose or whatever, and being like, well, no, this is what it means, and this is you should go into it with this lens. And then I feel like I have special 3D glasses that I can wear while I'm reading it that open my eyes to the world that is being created.
So I have two books for you. One, I can't believe that you have not heard of him given your West Virginia reference there in Appalachia. I was turned on to this guy by many, many songwriters, as a matter of fact. His name is Brees DJ Pancake. Have you ever heard of Brees
Oh,
DJ Pancake?
yeah. Scott has a story about him and his publisher going to Brees DJ Pancake's grave in one of his books, actually.
Yeah. I mean, have you read Brees DJ Pancake?
I
Oh,
haven't. I actually was somebody that I was just reading. Scott has like a manuscript of a book that he sent me that isn't published yet, where they go to this uh, grave, and I remember writing it down and then getting so lost in his book that I forgot to revisit.
Eventually so many songwriters had mentioned him, and I felt bad. I've never heard of this guy. Well, he was called the Hillbilly Hemingway.
Yeah.
That was his nickname. He wrote one book and then committed suicide in his 20s. So he only has one book of short stories, and it is the writing is amazing. So you definitely have to check that out. The other one I just read, I'm a big fan of Joe Wilkins. Joe Wilkins, he's a poet, but he also writes novels, and he's from Montana. And so all of his novels take place in that part of the country. So you get this incredible descriptions of the countries of the sweeping plains and the mountains. And there's issues of he just wrote the entire Sky is his recent book, and it just came out, and it talks about land use issues and things like that. But when you get a poet who can take figurative language and then drive a narrative, to me, that's the greatest.
I love when people can do that. I mean, we haven't even really talked about poetry, but they're like the other. I'm like that's another thing I look for when I'm reading. I another person that I've been like a completionist with is Franz Wright, the poet. Yeah, I don't know if you know him, but he's
Yeah.
incredible. And he's somebody that I like had devoured everything that he ever wrote. And another guy who's kind of reminds me of your description of Joe Wilkins called Michael Earl Craig, uh,
Yes.
which I know almost nothing about him, but I kind of, he's alive now. He's maybe like a, middle-aged dude just writing poetry in Michigan or something and publishing with these small publishers.
I gave up talking about poetry to songwriters because I've interviewed 400. Probably at this point, you're probably one of 10 who has ever read poetry. So, unfortunately, I long gave up on that question, which is why I don't even ask it anymore because I'm so afraid of the response. But you give me hope.
Poetry. I love poetry, but I'm very picky. Maya is like constantly she's my little for like traditional poetry, like the whisperer to my brain of like this is what it means. This is what the she when we met she dared me to write a villanelle and I was like a villanelle and it took me 5 years and I finally finished it recently.
My favorite is Galway Kinnell. He passed away within the past maybe 10 years. Galway Kinnell is from Vermont, I think. And so he's got that kind of, a lot of his poems are informed by that experience living up there. But I was at, I think, Powell's. I was at some bookstore. I think it was Powell's. And I went to the rare books part of the bookstore, used bookstore, and they had one of his poems, a poster size of his poems, but signed by him.
Whoa.
And it was expensive, but I'm like, you know what? And I remember looking at it and I bought it and it was framed downstairs in another room. But I remember taking it to pay for it and I got very emotional. Like I was starting to get tears in my eyes, like thinking about he signed this thing and what that means to me. And I don't know that I don't know the prose could do that to me the way poetry does, like move me the way that poems can.
It's I mean, sometimes it can't. Like Scott is a person that for some reason always moves me. Like I walk away like shaking. I'm always looking for the books that do that, and often cannot make it through books that I feel like I'm like, oh, you haven't teased that you're going to do that, so I'm not finishing it. Which is a bad way to go, but I'm like, no time.
The Joe Wilkins book did actually. Now that I think about it, by the end of that book, I was very, very moved. I mean, I started to well up, and it was those books. Yeah, those books just when they can do that for you, it's just I'll go back to it over and over again.
Oh, I mean, something you can reread is like such a gift in this life. It's like the people that make shit in this world and devote their lives to doing it, I feel like are that is what it is all about. That is like the greatest gift that you can give to human beings is reflecting their humanity back at them, especially now because it's like now it's like we're all like, fuck, what is real? Is the phone real? Which part is the part that is my life? And so I've noticed I mean, maybe this is just a normal progression that is not tied to any specific generation, but as we all spend more time in here in the phone, I'm like, I the more grateful I am for the people that like remind me of what life is like.
And that's it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget you can find all the episodes on all major streaming platforms and also at the Songwriters on Process website. That is at songwritersonpodcast.com. Pre-2020, this was not a pod. I was transcribing all of the interviews. So you can find all of them, hundreds of them, many hundreds of them on the Songwriters on Process website. You'll find both the transcribed interviews and the pod there. Take a deep dive, spend a day. These are great conversations with songwriters just about the writing process. Also, my book, Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari, is out now worldwide on Hachette Books. You can find it online in all major bookstores. Mark is a good friend. He is the guitarist in the metal band Lamb of God, and it's his memoir. Again, that is called Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari. I am biased, but that's a damn good book. My email, ben@songwritersonprocess.com. Send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love suggestions, questions, comments. People always email me and tell me who they want to see on the pod next. You never know. Send me an email, ben@songwritersonprocess.com. And that's it for me, everyone. Have a great day.